Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 55 of Unmasked. I'm your host, Neil Getzlow. As always, I thank you for coming on this journey with me. To my faithful listeners and viewers out there, now we are on YouTube. Hey, I'm so glad you're back this week. And if you are new to the Unmasked podcast, I'm so blessed that you're here. I encourage you to scroll through your podcast feed of the show and listen to some of the older episodes. And for everybody, please check out the video component of this podcast over on YouTube. Follow my channel over there. I'll put a link to it in the audio show notes. And I would love to have you to come over to YouTube and check out the show. We're going to be putting up some new content here going forward and trying to ramp things up on the video side of things as we go forward this spring. And you can always learn more about my journey over at neilgetzlow.com. And you can learn more about my journey as well as my book, Unmasked, Conquering Sexual Sin and Walking in Victory. Now, we did take a 1 week break from the show last week. I happened to be traveling internationally for work. Okay, it was just Mexico. So it wasn't like I was on any sort of exotic, far away getaway. It was a simple 3.5 hour plane ride to Mexico. But it was a work trip. I thought I'd be able to get in a chance to upload this episode, but didn't do it. So, I was like, we're just going to take a hiatus for 1 week, 1 week only, but we're back this week and excited to press on. And let's jump into today's episode. We are talking to Kylla Lanier. Kylla is the co-founder of Truckers Against Trafficking, an awesome organization. And they describe themselves as a mobile army of transportation professionals, and they're assisting law enforcement in the recognition and reporting of human trafficking in order to aid in the recovery of victims and the arrest of their perpetrators. And they literally do have an army of truckers across the U.S. who are now trained and looking for victims of sex trafficking. But what I really like about this organization is they also have a man-to-man campaign where they're providing information and resources to men to warn them about the dangers of sex trafficking, talk about the impact that pornography plays in raising the demand for sex trafficked individuals. So it's a really cool program. We're going to get into all that this week on episode number 55. And here we go, unmasking the journey of Kylla Lanier and Truckers Against Trafficking. Kylla, thank you so much for coming on the Unmasked podcast, now a video podcast. So I appreciate you being one of the early adopters.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get started, why don't you just take just a quick minute to introduce yourself and tell everybody what you're up to?
Sure. So my name is Kylla Lanier. I'm co-founder and deputy director of Truckers Against Trafficking, which is a nonprofit organization that operates throughout North America. And our mission is to educate, equip, empower, and mobilize members of the trucking, bus, and energy sectors to recognize and report human trafficking. And my job specifically is focused on the public sector, so law enforcement, state agencies, and also our global expansion.
So I know when sort of as we were emailing to set up this interview, I think you have a pretty interesting faith journey to share. So I always like to hear from my guest if there is a faith journey to get you guys to talk about it. And so, tell me a little bit about that. It sounds like you came from a very strong Christian family growing up, right?
Yes. So I was born into a Christian home, definitely devotionals and prayer every day at home. We went to church every Sunday. And I even went to a private Christian school from 6th grade through senior year of high school. So lots of Bible class and chapel and things of that nature. I will say that I did get to the point where I was pretty rebellious and walked away from God. I always like to akin it to, if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, when Lieutenant Dan is up on the top of the ship and he's yelling in the storm. That was my relationship with God for a nice period of time, because I was struggling. And, I do think sometimes it's important for us to come to a faith on our own terms and not just, inherit it, if you will, from our families. Like, we have to struggle with some of those issues ourselves. And I did. I came back to a walk with God, and Certainly bumps along the way, but God is a gracious God, and he always pulls you back. And I would say that in my life, that's definitely been the piece. He's always pulled me back no matter what, and given me the opportunity to do some really cool things as well.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about the ministry that your family has. I think that obviously has probably had some influence in how your adult career has gone. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about the ministry that your family is a part of.
Well, the ministry that we started together is no longer,
Okay,
that sort of came from that.
gotcha.
So, how Truckers Against Trafficking, or TAT, started was through my mom. She sent my sisters and I have three other sisters. She sent us a book called Not for Sale by David Batstone, which is like this good overview book of global domestic labor, sex trafficking. And she was like, you all need to read this book. So, you don't know my mom, but when she tells you to do something, you do it. So we all read the book, and I think we just were really stunned to learn that slavery still existed. We knew that there was injustice, we knew that there was exploitation, but that idea, that concept was like, whoa. And so we got on the phone for a conference call, because we all lived in different states, and we formed our first organization, which was Chapter 61 Ministries off of Isaiah 61. And we had the very lofty goal of ending human exploitation worldwide, because you can do that when you have full-time jobs and children to raise. But yeah,
Right.
we just sort of dove in, and as we studied the issue of human trafficking and we're learning from the experts in the field back in 2007, um, we're trying to find what was going to be our niche, like what was going to be our focus. And we my sister, who was our former executive director, she and her neighbor put on a big national um, anti-trafficking conference. And so we went to that, and Polaris was there, who runs the national hotline, Free the Slaves, a lot of big groups. And we went up there to learn from them. And in one of the breakout sessions that I went to, the guy was talking about training, his desire to train gas station attendants on human trafficking. And that just made really good sense to me. And I went back to my mom, and she had been reading the FBI, their big national operations, where they had always recovered both children and adult victims of sex trafficking. And she said one of the areas that they always recovered victims from, not the only area, but certainly one of the areas, was at truck stops. And she said, if we could get truck drivers to recognize this, and they knew what to do, they would do something about it. Her parents had owned a small motel in El Paso, Texas, when she was growing up, and most of their clientele were truck drivers. And she's like, most of them are really good guys. If they knew, they'd do something. And that was how TAT was born, first as an initiative of Chapter 61 Ministries, and then by 2011, all we were doing all the time was TAT work. And so we disbanded Chapter 61, and TAT became its own 501c3.
I mean, that's impressive, because how many truckers are there in the US on
3
average?
million.
3 million. Like, that is I mean, that's a pretty good army out there
Yeah.
looking for people that might be trafficked. And yeah, I mean, sort of that truck stop is, I think, kind of the old school maybe mentality of trafficking, but it's like that still is prevalent out there. I know, because of online, the way things escalated online, and that kind of thing happens, and it's a little trafficking maybe looks a little bit differently. But what are your truckers seeing out there today that you have a relationship with?
Right. So the trucking industry has 100% embraced this fight. And so we have partners within the truck stop industry, as well as trucking companies, trucking schools, all the trucking associations. And then you multiply that with the bus and energy sectors as well. But what you used to see was girls going door to door to door to the trucks and knocking on the cabs and asking if they wanted company. That has definitely changed. That there's been better security, better lighting. Truckers are calling in, and so the traffickers have adapted. Obviously, that might still happen in certain locations, but what you're seeing is maybe a car or an RV parked out back by the commercial vehicles. Typically, those are up by the store. But if they're backed by the commercial vehicles, they might be having an online advertisement, or they might have a CB radio and they're advertising that way. It might be a car that pulls in, drops somebody off, leaves, and then comes back 15, 20 minutes later to pick them up. Again, that's your trafficker taking the victim to the buyer and then coming back and picking them up. We have heard from truck drivers that they've had females approach under the guise of selling magazines, and so, or perfume. And so, if security approaches them, or if somebody approaches them, they have this like legitimate reason why they're in the lot, right? But then, as the truckers have discussed, the different magazines or the perfumes or whatever, and they're listening to the sales pitch, that's when sex is offered. And so they're using that as sort of like that protective thing to be missed by security right off the bat. It's also happening in hotels and motels that are near truck stops or strip clubs or adult bookstores or massage parlors. So a lot of times they will build up around these locations where there is a large single male population, and sort of, and the traffickers will then exploit those locations as well, to get the money.
Sure. Do you see, like you said, you've got better security in some of these truck stops and things, and like, so that's part of the side of the angle where I come from a little bit, is from the demand side. My story, I was the one that was contributing to that demand. Was there a hurdle to get over with truckers, as far, because I got to imagine some of them were contributing to the demand, right? So
Sure.
was there a hurdle to, maybe getting some traction to what you were doing at the very beginning?
Yeah, what I would say is it's a societal hurdle, and, the
Yeah.
trucking industry is one sector of society. The societal viewpoint on prostitution is like what? It's a victimless crime. It's the world's oldest profession, and therefore nobody's getting hurt. And if it's consenting adults, what's the big deal? And that's the hurdle, right? That's the hurdle, is saying, actually, it's absolutely not victimless. This whole idea of sex work, prostitution is neither sex nor work. It's a system of exploitation that churns up the most vulnerable amongst us. And because we have layered it with this like genteel language of sex work and clients and, sex acts and services, that's not what it is. I mean, it's this very exploitative type of system, but the old thought process of, victimless, it's no big deal, it's just a blowjob, it's just a this, it's just a that, that's just not reality. And so our hurdle was and continues to be, to a lesser degree, I think people are starting to get it a little bit more, is really helping them understand what prostitution actually is, and that it is exploitative, that there's almost always somebody on the back end forcing the people to prostitute, almost always a desperation, prior trauma, prior sexual abuse that is putting people out there with a lack of other viable options. So that really the 98% of the people in prostitution do not want to be there and would like to be out of it. And so when they started to think of it that way, then it's like that curtails, I would say, the vast majority of people that buy. Now, there's always going to be those buyers that do not give a care in the world about who they're buying or what they're doing.
Yep.
There are people, and we have had truck drivers come up to us at trucking shows and things, and they are sobbing because they have purchased sex acts in the past. And, I'd never want somebody to just like stay there, and I don't want people to feel like there's not life after that. But as they realized it, I was like, okay, now and now you do better. And now you tell other people about it as well. And you start talking about it, because as we can pull back that curtain and we can really give them the truth about what this industry is, that's how we're going to stop it. Men talking to other men, really getting this message out there. And yeah, you repent from it, but there is life forward.
Yeah, and I've got to say that, like, that was the biggest eye opener for me, was learning about who these women are, right? Because as a buyer, like, and I was so deep in my world in addiction that, and being fueled by pornography, right?
Right.
So it just, it didn't matter at the time, but when I was able to break free from it, and then I start to hear the facts like, well, most of these women are trafficked. Like it was a gut punch because I had never
Right.
considered it, right? And I wish I would have heard it earlier. I wish there was a man in my life. Now, but here's the problem though. Of course, I never told anyone. So
Right.
how would anyone know? Look at me and think, oh, he's a buyer. I need to talk to him. Like you wouldn't, but I wish I would have gotten those facts a little bit sooner because I think that would definitely make you stop and think.
Right. And that's what, when I'm training law enforcement or industry or whoever, I always say, the majority of men don't actually buy sex, but the majority of men are quiet on the topic. And I recognize that it doesn't come up at the breakfast table necessarily.
No.
I always, talk about my own family. We never had an explicit conversation about prostitution growing up.
Mm.
Like we never did. It never came up. It was not part of my world. And so I tacitly received messages, I assume from television or friends or wherever, that people in prostitution were there because they were drug addicts or they were just sort of dirty lower class people. And and that their pimps were their boyfriends that sometimes slapped them around, and that was sort of this idea that I had, having never had a conversation about it. And that made me view them as somehow lesser in society, or I could easily go along with jokes. It did still lead me into having these sort of like viewpoints, going along with the jokes about pimps, or, oh, that's pimping, that's pimp, right? Going along with laughing about things. And then as you learn the truth, right? As you learn the truth, you're like, whoa. And so what I say is, if men specifically would just start to talk about it. So like when that joke is made, simply saying something like, well, actually, do you know that most of the people in prostitution don't want to be there? And so if you are purchasing sex, like you're doing something against her will. Like it opens eyes, and that's not a defensive type of a thing to say. It's calm, it's factual. You're not jumping down anybody's throat. But if those conversations would be had, it would be great. And that was one of the reasons why TAC created our man-to-man campaign. We had truck drivers coming to us and saying, we're getting into conversations that we don't know how to have, or we don't know how
Wow.
to answer. And could you give us another tool? And so that's when we created the man-to-man campaign, with a video, with guiding questions that go along. And again, it's mostly men talking to other men about some of these myths surrounding the commercial sex industry. And that's available for free to anybody right on our website on the demand tab. Because I think the more conversations that can be had, the more some of that, just sort of the jokes and the myths and the ideas, they'll dissipate. And for someone like you, back in the day when you were entrenched in this, maybe somebody wouldn't have come up to you and said, hi, Neil, you need to, because they didn't know. But
Yeah,
if you were overhearing those conversations, those are seeds planted. And I think we
absolutely.
miss the opportunity when we just stay quiet or we're uncomfortable with it. Like if it would just become like, I can't tell you how much I like bring it up. I used to teach high school, and one of my students came to me 2 years after he had been in my class. So he was a senior, I taught sophomores. And he came back and he's like, you ruined my day. And I was like, I haven't even seen you today. Like, how did I ruin your day? And he said, well, in the locker room, all the guys were telling like pimp and hoe jokes. And all I could think about was, that's a sex trafficking victim and that's a trafficker. And I said, well, did you say something? And he goes, and I couldn't even laugh. And I said, I'm glad I ruined it for you, but now your job is to go and ruin it for somebody else. And he was like, oh. And like the concept of just maybe bringing that up and being like, hey guys, did you actually know? Or, my teacher used to say, that would maybe change things.
Yeah, and then that's the thing. Like I'm not going to be quiet. I think God has put it on my heart to talk about this very bluntly. He gave me a very dramatic testimony to share with people and to share with other men specifically. And so I have the opportunity to, on the demand side, work with Epic Project. I don't know if you're familiar with
I
Epic,
am. Yeah.
but I just had David Bennett on the show a few weeks ago talking about, you know, the work he's done with Epic. He brought me into that organization and helping to talk to men at the point of
Yeah.
them attempting to buy. And I just, I think about if I was in that situation and I called and it was a guy, like I might listen, like it's going to stop me, but it's only going to stop me for probably maybe just a few months, maybe. But then I probably would, um, I might go back to doing it. And that's where, for me, that's where God came in and like just broke me completely, which very blessed, very blessed for. Um, as you're out there talking with truckers and and having these interactions, I mean, do you see any trends out there of what's happening? Is it becoming more prevalent? Or is it just because there's more awareness that, like, there are more victims being rescued? I'm curious from your vantage point what you're seeing as far as that trafficking business, I guess.
Well, I think a lot of it has moved online. Um, whether that's the grooming or the exploitation itself. OnlyFans is being used heavily. They are exploiting their victims through there. That's already sort of set up like a pyramid scheme. And so they're bringing more and more people in. And then either they're recruiting the women that are already on OnlyFans that are doing it by their own choice. The traffickers are looking at them and they'll be like maybe their top fan and want a in-person meeting later. And then, that's when they get them. Or they're exploiting some of their younger victims through OnlyFans on some of the softer stuff where it's just photos, but then they're, escalating it and then, getting them out on the streets as well. I mean, the final goal is obviously, where they can bring in that most money. So you're seeing a lot of that online. You're also seeing an increase of familial trafficking
Mm,
that like skyrocketed during COVID, and it's even though the pandemic is subsiding, the trend is not, and so people have crossed that line. So grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts, siblings, they're selling their family members either for drugs, for rent, for just a different lifestyle, things that they want. And so you're seeing that. And obviously, especially if the victim is very young, you can't really put them out there in street-based prostitution without raising a lot of eyebrows. And so you've got a lot of residential brothels happening in people's homes, and people are going there and they're advertising um, again online. Or they're bringing them to certain locations where the buyers are.
sure. You've got 3 million truckers in the US, as you mentioned earlier. It's a pretty large base of people to try to reach with this information. Like, how are you able to do it? Are you having in-person meetings? I'm assuming you're working with trucking companies. Like, how do you how do you go after these truckers and enlist them into the fight?
In every way possible. So we are partnered with every trucking association, whether at the national level, the state level, local level. We also have our training online on demand where they can be certified TAT training. They can just go in individually and do it. We work with companies to embed it in orientation as well as, ongoing credit hours. We have podcasts that we get out there. We go through schools and ask them to make it part of the curriculum before a driver ever, gets their commercial driver's license in the first place. We're going through shippers. And so you have these big companies that may or may not have a private fleet, but they don't, even if they have a private fleet, they don't have enough trucks to move all of their product. And so they contract with a number of trucking companies. And so we will ask shippers to basically make it part of their hiring process that the companies that they work with are TAT trained. And
That's
so
awesome.
that's another reach. So really any possible level, that's where we're going after. And we have trained 1.5 million.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, to have that kind of reach and impact is huge. So, you talk. So, speaking of the training, I know that you have some red flags that you share with truckers as part of this educational process. Like, what are some of those red flags that you share with the truckers, so that as they're out, out on the move, that they understand and they know what to look for?
So I mentioned some of them earlier on, whether it's that private personal vehicle like a RV or a car out back by the commercial vehicles and people are coming to and from it. If you have somebody that is controlling money for somebody else, if when they're talking to somebody, they're referring to their daddy maybe, or having to make a quota, and they might not use the word quota. They might say something like, I've got to make that last 200, or my daddy will be mad, or, well, I can't go home and sleep until I make that last 100, or I just need $50 more and then I can have dinner. Whatever it is, that's the quota, because the trafficker puts a quota on every victim. It might be, like I mentioned, that car pulling in, dropping somebody off, leaving, and then coming back. It could be CB chatter about commercial company. Almost always you have a trafficking victim there. It could be people going into a motel, only staying for 20 minutes or something, and then coming back out and getting in their trucker car, and spending the night there, or just leaving and not coming back. It can be anything like that. They could have a branding tattoo, something that's sort of transactional, whether that's money signs or cash only, daddy's money maker, something like that. So, not always, but sometimes the traffickers will brand their victims.
Do you have an opportunity to work with law enforcement at all, and help educate and bring awareness to them on
Yeah,
what to look for?
that's my job. So that's my job within TAT. I train law enforcement all across the country, and in Canada as well. And so we have a 4-hour in-person law enforcement training. I'll be in Vermont next week. We were just in New York, and that was out in California. So we're all over, training on indicators, training on a victim-centered approach, really trying to humanize victims of trafficking for officers, because oftentimes they will have that really hard edge. They will appear to be willing participants in what is happening to them. They're going to speak provocatively. They're going to dress provocatively. They're going to be in your face. They're going to tell you, no, that's not my trafficker. That's my man. Like they're going to present more like a criminal than they are a victim, but helping them to understand this is a victim and that's just a trauma response. Like that is a defense mechanism and a trauma response from everything that they've experienced. But yeah, we work with law enforcement on adopting models in their state, where they can raise awareness within the commercial vehicle industry, but also on interdiction and inspection stops, whether they're pulling over a station wagon, a van, or a big 18-wheeler, no matter who they're pulling over, what indicators to look for.
And, do you also get into, I know there's kind of this shift in mindset, I think, in public, and especially maybe in legislative circles, where the law enforcement would typically go after the trafficked victim, and that person would end up facing legal repercussions for being forced into this. Where and then the buyer slash trafficker sort of was called a John, and maybe got a little bit of shame, but that's about it, and left to go, continue down the road and do this. Do you see that conversation occurring more often? And do you think that there's going to be an like the tide is turning when it comes to how law enforcement goes after the trafficking side of things?
Yeah, well, law enforcement has to enforce the law. And until the laws shift or a policy within an agency shifts, I mean, their job is to do the enforcement of the
Yeah.
criminal code. So, what we tell them to do is screen. Obviously, they're not going to arrest a trafficking victim. But again, it's helping them understand your gut's not going to be able to tell you, is that a trafficking victim or is that a by choice, prostitute? Your gut's not going to be able to tell you that. And so you've got to have the proper screening tools to ask the right questions to elicit this. You also need to approach them as a victim and use a victim-centered approach to help bring down some of those barriers and walls so that you can actually build your case. So we try to give them those tools to assess. And what we ask when we have command staff in the room specifically is, like, if you don't have to arrest them, don't arrest them. That doesn't even have to be a legislative change. That can just be an agency policy, because we do talk about traditionally and historically in this country, in prostitution cases, we've arrested the prostituted person, and almost always they are a victim. Then we learned about human trafficking. We went after the trafficker, but who do we still let go? The buyers. And they are the absolute core of the entire industry, because traffickers, for as horrific as they are, and they are very bad, they are at the end of the day criminal businessmen, and so they are going to where the money is, and people are not understanding the people that are making the traffickers rich are your buyers of commercial sex.
Yeah.
And so I say, we talk about, do the UC ops that are demand reduction focused, go after the buyers. We do need to change those criminal codes on the buyers, because in a lot of states it's just a misdemeanor. There's only a couple of states that have made it a felony. And we need to make that a felony so that it has more of a sting. And, and then law enforcement can, in fact, enforce that. But what we see across the country when we train law enforcement, because we always have a survivor that shares her interactions with law enforcement and a little bit of her story and stuff, and trains them on how best to approach. They are always highly moved and sometimes crying, and they'll say, I've missed that. I never knew, and so that's the first part. That's like the first step, is really humanizing, helping them to get it. And then, you get to the next step and the next step and the next step.
Sure. So actually, over the weekend, I had a chance to participate in a Citizens Academy with Dan Nash and Allison Phillips for the Human Trafficking Training Center, which is just fascinating to get all that information. But there were one thing that just stood out to me, and as you were talking about the money aspect, like one woman can bring a trafficker, I think Dan said, like $200,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy's probably has 5 women that he's controlling. So $1 million a year. So yeah, so when Dan's talking about, like the people getting out of drugs and they're getting into human trafficking because it's a lot easier,
Right.
a lot easier to make money. And people, I mean, even though awareness is starting to rise and people are starting to put some attention to it, it's still probably light years behind where we are in people looking at drugs or things like that.
Right. I mean, it's a big ship to turn around, and it takes time, but we just keep chipping away. And I do believe that it is starting to happen, where people are starting to get it, but there's just a lot more work to do. But absolutely, there's money to be made, and there's less interaction with law enforcement. Like, if I'm a trafficker selling drugs, I have to actually be there to make the drug deal.
Yeah.
When I am trafficking people, once I've broken them in, I don't even have to be
Yeah.
around. If they're on automatic, that's one of the terms they use. If they're on automatic, they can even be in another state and still comply with what the trafficker's saying, because they're so mentally chained to them. And so if anybody's getting arrested, it's the victim. And
Right,
that's the part that has to change.
Well, and then I got to imagine that when the victim's getting arrested, she's probably not offering up.
Mm-mm.
Like you said, it's just my boyfriend or whoever. They're not offering up as a victim
Right.
anyways,
Right.
because of what they've experienced.
Right. And that's the challenge.
Yeah.
That's the challenge, because either out of just sheer fear or a trauma bond, or they really do believe the trafficker loves them, or the trafficker has their child back somewhere else, and so that's leverage, or, somebody else is being threatened in their family. There's a lot of reasons why they're not going to say anything. And then they also, I would say this, people in prostitution, whether they're trafficked or they're there through lack of other viable options, they were raised in the same society you and I were. So they have all of that shame of being in prostitution, and they have internalized all of the messages that they're receiving, whether that's from their trafficker, every buyer that uses them, every person in society that looks down upon them. They've internalized that shame. They've internalized that sense of worthlessness. They've internalized that they are not worth helping. And so when that first approach is made, they've got all of the fear and the trauma bond and or whatever, tie they have with the trafficker. But on top of that, they have just this deep sense of, I'm not even worth your time. And so all of this sort of complicates these cases. Not impossible to overcome, but they complicate the cases.
Sure. I was about maybe 6-8 months ago, I had a former brothel owner and and someone who's a prostitute on the show, and talking to her about it. And she's since has gotten out, is now an advocate for to help people get out of trafficking.
Right.
But she said one of the most interesting things that she said was, because she was not trafficked, but she said poverty was her pimp.
Yep.
It's just like, that just blew me away, because she couldn't escape it, because the money was such a lure, and she had no other alternative to make ends meet but to prostitute herself.
Right.
And that's the part that's hard. And I wish as a society we could have different conversation about this, and not celebrate this idea of sex work, which people
Right.
celebrate and think, oh, we talked about OnlyFans earlier, and these teenage girls can go on there and think they can make, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And maybe some of them are making money on there, but at what cost?
Right.
That's the hard part, I think.
Yeah, one of the best books I've ever read is Paid For by Rachel Morin. And she would tell you she's a survivor. Says she is a survivor of the sex trade. She does not claim being a trafficking victim, although under our standards, she was exploited in Ireland. But in the US, we would have called her a CSEC, or a commercially sexually exploited child, because she was 15 when she first entered trafficking. And it was through lack of viable options, massive dysfunction and trauma and abuse at home. And so here she is out on the streets. In her book, she really does a fantastic job of talking about, it doesn't matter how you get in, whether it's through lack of other viable options, whether it's through a trafficker, or whether it's quote unquote by choice, maybe that 2% that's there. We all exit the same. We all exit with extreme trauma, multiple rapes, a different viewpoint on life, on sex, on love, on, so many things. We exit with higher rates of PTSD and mental health issues. We exit with extreme depression and anxiety. We exit oftentimes with substance dependency. So how you get in, people aren't thinking, well, but I'm choosing this. I'm putting these pictures out there. I'm in control. The exit and what it does to you that you're not really aware of, that's the part that nobody's really counting the cost on this. And they're not seeing also where the traffickers are coming in to exploit. And they like OnlyFans traffickers do. I mean, they're like, man, she's already doing the work for me. She's breaking herself down. She's crossing over these lines of inhibition. It'll be easy once I have them. I won't even have to work so hard. So they're sort of setting themselves up for that. And, in societies that have fully decriminalized or legalized prostitution, which there's always people that think, oh, just legalize it and then it'll be regulated and then we won't have trafficking anymore or whatever. Like, look at the stats in every country where they've legalized or fully decriminalized it. You've seen an increase of sex trafficking. Why? Because people are not signing up to be a part of the exploited class. They're signing up to buy sex. They're signing up to be a manager or a brothel owner, which is your trafficker, right? They're signing up to make money off of it or to get sex out of it. but people aren't signing up to go and work in these mega brothels. They're not signing up to be a part of this. That's where the force, fraud, and coercion comes in, and the lack of other viable options. And what we see is this normalization of objectification, this normalization of transactional sex. And it comes at an extremely high cost to society. When that viewpoint is there, everybody that we see in prostitution, or everybody, what is the assumption then? Oh, they want to be there. It's legal. It's decriminalized. They want to be there. And so there's no help brought to bear. There's nobody even questioning, do you want to be there? Because, well, of course it's legal. Therefore you want to be, right? Like, it just takes away even the idea that somebody might be forced. And it also takes law enforcement's ability to do anything away in these systems, because they would have to have the same onus of evidence that they would to go into a restaurant and do a raid, or to go into a hair salon and do a raid, right? And so they couldn't just pull somebody over and say, are you okay? Is somebody forcing you to do this? No, you would have to have all of this evidence. It leaves victims without recourse. And what you see is an increase of victimhood, an increase of sex trafficking in these locations. So with the sex work movement, the pro-prostitution lobby here in the US, and this like push with OnlyFans and all this online exploitation, and no, but I'm choosing it. I don't see, I mean, they just do not see the bigger picture. They do not see the bigger picture, and they do not see the impact of these choices.
Do you see more of a pro legalizing prostitution movement across the U.S. in different state legislators?
Oh yeah, there's, I mean, I think it's popped up in already 9 state legislatures. It's been
Wow.
defeated, but
Yeah.
these bills are coming, and they're coming hard. And this started where you saw a big push was end of 2019 on through, and they're still coming up. And the anti-trafficking movement, heavily, World Without Exploitation is one of the big leaders on trying to beat down this legislation as it continues to pop up. But yeah, I mean, you're just getting more and more bills introduced, all under the guise of public health, all under the guise of protection for women. It's feminist rhetoric that is masking total misogyny, right? Like, it's
Right.
just like, we're saying it's women's empowerment, we're saying it's protection for women, safety for women, but really it's just making it easier for men to exploit said women. So yeah, I mean, I would say the pro-prostitution lobby is doing a darn good job. And then, like I said, the rise of OnlyFans, and it grew exponentially with COVID. And those numbers are continuing to increase. I think it was like 17 million or 30 million user. I can't remember the exact, but it was somewhere in the double digits. And then it was like 121 million users. It just jumped in 2020. And so you're seeing this increase, but it's that type of, but this is safe, but this isn't really prostitution. Well, this isn't really this. I'm in control. There's no exploitation taking place here. That type of mindset, and then people defending it, unfortunately, this feeds the pro-prostitution lobby, because the sex work lobby will say, see, these are just independent sex workers, and you're like calling them trafficking victims or exploited people, and they're not. They're just paying their rent, right? And so they'll use those types of stories. So it's very frustrating. I mean, you can read all of their stuff. They have a very well-heeled, well-funded movement,
I have no doubt.
unfortunately.
And I guess I don't know if this is in Time Magazine. I think it might have been in Time Magazine. They did this piece on OnlyFans creators, and so they're trying to equate these women who are taking off their clothes and doing and getting men to pay for them, like the same thing as like a YouTube creator.
Yeah.
And trying to conflate the two, and again, just kind of normalize it in society. So yeah, I think it's a dangerous slope, and I can see it coming. So I'm glad there's people like you and Dan and Allison and others who are already out there, sort of trying
Yeah,
to block
we'll
some of
fight
these.
it.
Yeah, for sure. So hey, before I let you go, what's the future of TAT look like? Have you thought about where it goes from here?
Yeah, well, we still have a lot of work to do in the industries we work with. We still have truck drivers that we haven't reached. We still have bus drivers and school bus drivers around the country in Canada that we haven't reached. Same with the energy industry. So really just continuing to deepen our programming. But we also are wanting to, look at and leverage some of our partnerships with corporations on, just getting this word out there. How can they, within their own systems of play, their own areas where their corporations are, how can they lessen vulnerabilities to trafficking in their own communities? How can they um, work to level the playing field for people that are disproportionately trafficked, and that's your BIPOC community. How can they, so really there's just so many really cool things, and helping to broaden our language to a lot of the corporate people that we work with. So some of the trucking companies like a Walmart or a Bridgestone, or that's a tire company, but obviously there's a lot of corporate people. So like, how can we broaden this language and get everybody within these companies that we're partnered with to really take on this issue? I mean, you think of the exponential impact of getting everybody focused on this, everybody donating to their local food pantries, everybody, out there trying to find ways to lessen vulnerabilities in their own communities. I mean, we will cripple traffickers. If I always say trafficking is an everywhere problem, so it's an everybody solution. But I also have always said, where are the good people? There's more of us than there are traffickers. Traffickers seem to know and go to people that need food or housing or a job or whatever, and they're providing those things. If we can't do everybody each individually, but if I can go to this person and say, hey, do you need to talk, with no agenda in mind? Hey, do you need a meal, with no agenda?
Yeah.
Like, we cripple the traffickers that way.
Yeah, and and like we talked about earlier, I think it does all come back to demand, right? And how do we cut the demand? And you're sort of working on the byproduct of it, where I think men have to step up, and other people on like organizations like Exodus Cry, who are
Yeah,
trying to slow the demand for pornography, because that is just the jet fuel that's being poured all over this. That's fueling
absolutely.
this demand, and that's where we've got to start. So that way we don't need, we can focus your resources somewhere else, right? But it is what it is for now.
Right. And I would say, within the trucking industry, within the bus industry, within these corporations, there are a lot of men.
Yes.
And again, when we open their eyes to this issue and they begin to speak about it and they begin to have conversations within their own families, but also within their sphere of influence, within their communities and within their corporations or their companies, this is where the change will happen. I 100% agree with that. And it's part of it is that eye opening, that awareness, and then starting to nuance and level it out. Like, okay, well, we have had that initial conversation. We know what trafficking is, but now let's look at some of these things that fuel it, like porn, like buying, like just all of the myths around
Yeah.
prostitution, and sort of peeling back those layers. And it is a layered, nuanced response, and we need everybody in this fight.
Kyla, hey, thank you so much for your time today. I truly appreciate it, and best of luck to you going forward. Keep sending prayers your way that you're going to be able to continue to make an impact. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, Neil.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks again to Kyla for coming on Unmasked this week. I appreciate all the work that she's doing with Truckers Against Trafficking. And I'm also going to put a link to their man-to-man campaign down in the show notes below. Check it out and share it with the men in your life. All right, coming up next week, we're going to stay on the theme of sex trafficking. We're talking to Heidi Olson. Heidi is a pediatric nurse, and she also owns her own consulting firm, Paradigm Shift. And she's on the front lines of this battle against sex trafficking every single day. Not only is she looking for kids that come into the ER and come into the hospital, and being able to identify what kids could potentially being impacted by, whether it's sex trafficking, whether it's online pornography, and that kind of thing. But she's also she's sharing her expertise in helping to train law enforcement agencies all over the country. She's also testified in front of Congress on Capitol Hill. She's also working in the state of Missouri to change laws. And she's an amazing individual. She's got an incredible story to tell, and I'm just very blessed and honored to be able to share it. And that's coming up next week on Unmasked. All right, everybody. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for tuning in this week. Truly appreciate it. And remember, Jesus did not come to hang out with the saints and the righteous. He came to hang out with the sick and the sinners of the world, just like you and just like me, but not to revel in our sin, but to call us out of it. Have a great week, everybody.